Hello and welcome to today's event, which is being held jointly between the Intellectual Forum at Jesus College, Cambridge, the Australian National University and the Centre for Social Impact at the University of New South Wales. My name's Julian Huppert. I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus College, Cambridge, which you can see behind me. And the aim of our centre is to get people to think and to talk about many of the crucial issues of our time. Jesus College itself is ancient. It's weathered many changes. It was originally a 12th century nunnery and then became an all-male college in 1496, although we've since corrected that and are fully co-educational. We've seen many changes, new machinery, new inventions, civil and world wars, pandemics of the past. We've brought in, over the last few years, some astonishingly good speakers, from fashion designer Jimmy Choo and former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark. We've had the director of NASA's Deep Space X-ray Observatory, Belinda Wilkes. We've had Al Jean, the executive producer of The Simpsons, many, many more. Quite recently, we had the Assistant Director General of the World Health Organization talk about vaccine equity around the world. We also showcase some of the amazing work that's being done by our own academics. One of them is using synthetic biology to come with a new, safe, clean way to dye clothes. Another does experiments with the coldest things in the universe that are even colder than outer space. And another is leading groundbreaking work to use financial systems to tackle climate change. If you want a treat, do have a look at the Jesus College YouTube channel, where many of these are captured. And you can hear all of these delights, and you can also hear more. The president of our college, a distinguished linguist, talking about the history of swear words and other taboo language. It's one of my favorites. We are recording this event, by the way, so that people who couldn't show up now will be able to watch it. And one of the joys of what we do is a huge range of people we work with. And today I'm really pleased to be working especially with one of our senior research associates at Intellectual Forum, Dylan Tampapalai, who's Associate Professor and Director of Education at the Centre for Social Impact in the University of New South Wales. And Dylan's going to lead this fantastic discussion about an issue that's hugely important and timely. Although I have to say, the wider issues and the background to it have probably been a big problem since well before this ancient institution was founded. And later this year, we're going to be launching a training program with edX online about Me Too and what you can do to help tackle sexual harassment in or out of the workplace. So it's a great pleasure to have the fantastic panel here. And Dylan, over to you.
Thank you, Julian, and welcome to you all for what will be a very exciting and interesting discussion. It's been, dare I say, an autumn of discontent here in Australia, with some rather unprecedented events occurring, allegations against the then sitting Attorney General, a march upon Parliament House, and many other matters that have arisen, which are sadly showing the prescience of the hashtag MeToo movement and the very important issues that it raises and our need to engage with those issues. Our panelists this evening are a great collection of speakers with very diverse perspectives, though I should note that they are, I think, all Australian with a strong ANU connection, and I think hopefully I can add a University of New South Wales mix in there somewhere, given my role as an associate professor at CSI and UNSW. Our first panelist this evening is Ms. Yasmin Poole, who's the National Ambassador for Plan International and a law student at the ANU. Our other panelist is Jenna Price, Dr. Jenna Price rather, academic and journalist at the ANU. Dr. Sarah Steele is our third panelist, a law academic at Cambridge University. And our final panelist is Kieran Pender, honorary lecturer at the ANU College of Law, and has done much work on hashtag MeToo and sexual harassment with the International Bar Association. I'll call upon Yasmin to be our first speaker. So over to you, Yasmin.
Thanks, Dylan, and thanks everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you all virtually tonight. As I sit in lockdown, it's very nice to actually hear from people. So I'm going to be providing, I think, more of the young women's perspective on the recent movement in Australia and what this all means. So just to provide some brief background if people aren't familiar, perhaps they're from the UK. there was a really brave young woman called Brittany Higgins that stepped forward and shared her story about how she was raped in Parliament House, and how essentially there was a series of cover-ups by politicians and who really politicised it. And she was eventually, she eventually left her role. In conjunction with allegation as well. And that led to a series of protests across Australia, marching for women's rights and calling for accountability, essentially, led by women across the country. So I was one of the attendees of the protest, and something that really struck me in that moment was this symbolic element of women standing outside of Parliament House calling for change while decision makers sat inside, and many of which did not act or listen. And to me, it actually encapsulated the feeling of what the recent movement in Australia felt like, really shouting from the outside and calling for those inside to listen. And I think what all of women that have stepped forward, what it really revealed is that sexual abuse and harassment of women in Australia is far too common. And in fact, the majority of victims of sexual harassment and assault are young women, many of which in their late teens. So one of the first aspects that really stood out to me of this movement is that women, and particularly young women, are losing faith that their decision makers will adequately represent their interests and their voices. And that was really demonstrated, I think, in the handling of what happened to Brittany Higgins. And that included, to me, when the Prime Minister didn't seem to really understand the issue. And there was a really telling interview with him on A Current Affair when he himself said, this has taken me deeper into this issue than I've appreciated before. And there was also a series of blunders in my eyes, saying that he acted because his wife essentially told him to act, things, saying things like, it's lucky that the protesters weren't met with bullets, that really showed, I think, a lack of understanding about the daily experience women can face in Australia when it comes to sexual violence. Not to mention the politicization of something that should never be politicized. And yet we saw that happen. The backgrounding of Brittany Higgins' partner. We also saw that, like I mentioned, cover-ups, failures to report, even female politicians that were really sucked into that culture and didn't actually step forward and say something either. And there's some really telling statistics developed that was surveyed by Plan International Australia in their Week in Lead report this year. And it found that 3/4 of young Australian women aged 18 to 21 do not believe that women involved in politics are treated equally to men. Just 1 in 10 Australian young women believe that the work culture in Canberra is safe for young women to work in, not to mention that 81% of young women have never considered or aspired to be Prime Minister. And to me, that shows two things. The first, as I mentioned, is that loss of trust that decision makers will represent the voices of young women, but also that young women don't even feel safe to put their hand up and run or to get involved in politics. And to not feel safe, to not even feel like your bodily autonomy will be respected in the highest decision-making institution and from a political level is really, really quite scary for our democracy. And I think that's something that I've been thinking about. What does this mean for our democracy that young women just don't trust that our decision makers will adequately listen to them or represent them? But we also saw, I think, on a more positive note, to me, a paradigm shift across young women that we can stand up and speak out. And there was a really telling moment in March for Justice in Melbourne, at least that I saw, where there were young girls, some as young as 12, that were standing in front of the crowd and sharing their experience of sexual abuse. And that is huge. Schoolgirls, some were crying, some were shouting, some had no expression at all. But considering the pressure on young women to not be feminist, and I can speak from personal perspective, being in high school, there's a lot of pressure to not even identify as a feminist and to really push that away. But to actually stand up and speak and share that story is something really powerful. And I think it was that momentum of really people galvanizing, women kind of coming together actually and standing by one another, that was really, really powerful. So throughout this movement, alongside what happened in Parliament, we also saw this rise of young women demanding that we need consent education in schools. And Chanel Contos's petition, which called for consent education, was came from the backs of thousands and thousands and thousands of testimonies of women, particularly young women, sharing their stories of sexual violence, particularly at the hands of boys from all boys private schools. And what was really, I think, striking about that, and something it showed to me, is that young women are calling for change. The fact that we have to call for consent education shows that decision makers haven't been consulting with young women, despite us disproportionately being the group that are affected by these issues. Chanel was saying we need education around toxic masculinity, around slut shaming, around victim blaming, around queer sexual education, all of these things. So to me, it really demonstrated this lack of co-design, but also the fact that young women are leading this conversation and are showing decision makers what needs to be changed. So I think I'll sum up by maybe some future things that I'm going to be looking out for. The first is, will Parliament act? Will they actually implement the Respect at Work recommendations? One of which is a positive duty to protect employees. So not just getting rid of the bad apples, but actually taking positive steps to ensure it's safe. The second is, how will the movement connect with other movements? So for example, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous women are 32 times more likely to be hospitalized as a result of domestic and family violence. So how can we actually connect, work together and strengthen in a united way? And the final point is, how can we amplify young women's voices? So we've seen Grace Tame, Chanel Contos, Brittany Higgins, and a number of other powerful young women that have been leading this cause. But what can we do as a community to ensure that we're sustaining their voices, that we're putting them in positions of power and keeping them safe as well? So I'll wrap up by saying, I think this movement showed that one voice can really create a massive movement, and that's exactly what it's shown. So I think it's a time of accountability, but it's also a time, I like to think, of a level of hope, because I think having these conversations is really important, and I'm glad that we can have them.
Thank you, Yasmin. Jenna Price.
Hello, my name's Jenna Price, and I want to talk to you about my experience of writing about defamation law in Australia. I think I understand that most of you are law students who are in the audience. In Australia, the law protects sexual abusers and sexual harassers. And in Australia, those perpetrators can't be held to account. There are plenty of men who are getting away with rape right now and never get punished for it. And that's partly because of the way our legal system treats people who are victims, but it's partly the way that the law is written. Australia's defamation laws get in the way of truth, and former Press Freedom Medal winner Michael Cameron once described them as the worst laws in the English-speaking world. He said to me, if it wasn't for journalists, Harvey Weinstein would still be producing films. But if the Weinstein story had come out in Australia, he would be suing you, and he would probably have a good chance of winning. When he said that to me, I felt absolutely terrified, but I also knew he was right. The freedoms that are available to journalists in the US and the UK are not available here in Australia. We don't have a public figure test, for instance. We don't have a First Amendment. We don't have a Charter of Freedoms. So the Me Too cases in Australia are at a standstill. That lack of protection of journalists is affecting the most vulnerable, who are the victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment in this country. As one of our most senior investigative journalists, Kate McClymont, said to me, I think these defamation laws are genuinely having an impact on our coverage of the Me Too movement. She once told me the story of a woman who'd approached her with an allegation of rape against quite a well-known television figure. She said she had absolutely no reason at all to disbelieve the woman who'd come to her. But in the end, it came to what she thought would happen in court. It would be her word against his word, and with the onus on the media to disbelieve, and with the onus on the media to prove that what we know is true. And that would be devastatingly costly for any media company in Australia, and devastatingly costly for any future defamation case. So basically her word against his word. And we've seen that play out in 1,000 courtrooms across Australia, where women are shamefully treated in cases involving sexual harassment, abuse and assault. And how much worse is it when a junior employee has to stand up to an executive from her own workplace? Women can't afford to take these cases to court. And the one group, journalists who can interrogate the issues, who can hold the powerful to account, are frozen by these defamation laws. As McClarmont says, the current lawsuits involving the Me Too movement has had a chilling effect on more women coming forward. So what can we do? The current Shadow Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, was a defamation lawyer for 20 years, often representing media organisations. The comments by Cameron and McClarmont concern him deeply. He says it's troubling if defamation laws are preventing women from coming forward with complaints of abuse, and suggests that perhaps we should broaden the kind of public interest which covers politicians. To explain simply, when journalists report on political or government matters, it's covered by a qualified privilege under common law, and there's an implied freedom under the Constitution to report on those. Of course, it's in the public interest that we are informed of what our politicians are doing. We had a rather extraordinary occurrence with one of our senior politicians a few years back. He was the kind of person who was always espousing family values, but it turns out that he had 2 partners at once and 5 children with 2 different women. The original coverage of the story was unashamedly tabloid. The politician's name was Barnaby Joyce, and a photographer took a photo of his newer partner, extremely pregnant, and the headline was Bundle of Joyce. Decades ago, we might not have known about this politician's hypocrisy, and now we do. And that's better for all of us to understand the kind of level of hypocrisy. But that is not the same as being able to accuse someone confidently that you will be supported in a courtroom and be able to win if you're accusing them of either sexual assault or sexual harassment. With Barnaby Joyce, I mean, there are many he has many levels of hypocrisy, but that very blatant one where he was telling us that we had to really espouse family values. You'll remember that he was a person who said that young women shouldn't be allowed to get Gardasil for free, shouldn't be on the free list, because having Gardasil, which is the vaccine against the human papilloma virus, which gives women cervical cancer and gives men anal cancer. So he really worked hard to stop that being on the free list, because he claimed that it would increase promiscuity. Not that I think he ever had Gardasil to have that as his excuse. But while all of this is going on, companies are also using another legal tool, which is the non-disclosure agreement, as a tool to shut down individual cases of sexual harassment. While some big investors, some of the big superannuation peaks, are putting pressure on companies to tighten up on their responses to sexual harassment at work, fewer than 1 in 10 of our top 200 companies consider this an important workplace issue at the board level. They don't even consider it at the board level. They leave it up to human resources, a part of most companies which I consider to be neither very resourceful nor very human. I cannot tell you the number of stories I've written where HR has put the company's needs first and the sexual harasser's needs first. My least favourite experience of dealing with any of this was where you'll all remember AMP Capital, the case of AMP Capital. Bo Pahari was the chief executive, and he walked away with around $50 million when he left the company. I think he's just about to leave or has left the company already. His victim is still unemployed. I interviewed that woman who refused to sign a non-disclosure agreement. She said non-disclosure agreements are designed to muzzle survivors of sexual harassment, protect perpetrators, and help mask what she described as a toxic company culture. And that enables the harmful behaviour in the first place. She says NDAs are used by most companies and aid in contributing to a culture of silence, and that's what we need to stop. Breaking this silence is an intimidating and precarious undertaking, as any woman who's ever talked about sexual harassment at work or sexual assault at work will tell you. And that is one of the reasons why sexual harassment and assault cases are severely underreported. What's happening now with Me Too is that we are losing sight of the public policy problem. as we see and hear all the witnesses in all of the cases, as we're moved by one person's predicament and another person's predicament, we forget that at the heart of this is those who violate women cannot be held to account. This part of improving public policy, this way of ensuring we speak truth to power, is lost behind the headlines. Me Too is a really crucial movement, and we've seen its positive effects in the US, where companies and their executives must account for what they've done and make sure it doesn't happen again. But here in Australia, where if the lawyers and journalists who deal with these cases are right, women's voices are being stifled and victims are afraid to come out and be exposed to public scrutiny. Just because your boss has sexually assaulted you should not mean that your pain and privacy are exposed for all to see. Is that the kind of country we want our young people to grow up in? Or do we want a country where power can be held to account? The defamation laws in Australia must be changed. Otherwise, the wealthy and powerful will get away with sexual assault and may even get away with murder. You are law students. I hope you can work to help make this change. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. Sarah Steele.
Hello all. So I'm coming, of course, you can probably hear the Australian accent with an awareness of the Australian environment, but having lived and worked in the United Kingdom for quite some time. So I'm going to give more the British perspective here. One of the things that comes to mind to say is that while Jenna's really highlighted unique issues in Australia around defamation law, and Yasmin's kind of highlighted the issues that have been faced there for young women, the UK has many similar issues. A recent survey here amongst school students showed that over 10,000 of them were able to provide testimony of sexual harassment and assault happening in schools here in the UK. Of course, the Sarah Everard case highlights the many issues that have prompted women in the United Kingdom to also march in London and other places. And there has been a routine sort of revelation in every kind of professional survey from professional organizations and the like, that sexual harassment and violence are pervasive issues. They're issues that certainly overwhelmingly affect women, but are not only issues for women. One of the things that comes out routinely in the UK data, and certainly is something that's mirrored in my experience running active bystander sessions around sexual harassment and violence, is that this affects men as well. It certainly affects non-gender identifying individuals, so trans individuals, individuals who are genderqueer or do not choose to identify with a particular gender, maybe pansexual, pangender, etc. So we've had just a diversity of individuals across different sectors here in the UK who've highlighted the pervasive nature of these issues and across different disciplines and areas. I work often in clinical schools, and we've seen the BMA and other bodies report on a wealth of different issues and note that there is a significant impact on men as well. So while I want to really emphasize that while we're talking a lot about women today, we're not limiting this to sexual assault, sexual violence, and any of its forms, and the harassment of just women. What I will say, and what's kind of come out of, I think, our previous two speakers, is that certainly the Me Too movement across 2020 and 2021 has augmented. Digital feminism of this kind of activist nature has had a profound impact on consciousness raising. It has made us increasingly aware that there is an issue. But what I'm really interested in is how we translate that to action. One of the things that I really wanted to focus on is that social media certainly has been a great way for us to be heard, for people to share their stories, for survivors to be able to emphasize what happened to them, what impact it has had, and to create awareness, a groundswell almost, and highlight how prolific this is. It has really, I think the key thing for me has been to highlight that pervasiveness in society. But while we've seen that attention rise, certainly here in the United Kingdom, it has been met with a backlash and online behaviours that highlight we have an incredibly long way to go. One thing that we see when individuals post their Me Too stories is often they are met with slut shaming, they're met with death threats and other threats of violence. they're met with misogynistic comments, they're met with different things. We've seen doxing here in the UK, for example. That's, for those of you who don't know what that is, that's where somebody releases somebody's personal private details, such as their address and their location, to the public so that they can then be attacked in person. This has happened around the Me Too movement, where people have told stories of their sexual assault or their sexual harassment in an ongoing way. And I think it's really highlighted we have a long way to go. And I think that also sits with the statements that were made by the previous panelists about there needing to be some kind of positive action now. And really, I work with the toolbox of active bystander training, with the 5 Ds, which empower individuals to take this. So I think for me, the real place that I would go going forward from this is to say that there is absolutely a top-down need for leaders to take this seriously, but there's also the capacity for every single person here to make changes and engage as active bystanders to both point out and address poor behavior when it happens, but also to model good behavior in their daily practice. And kind of being able to step in, to have that articulation and be able to respond when you see poor behavior in a really effective way. We can learn a lot from social psychologists and public health specialists who work on interventions. And I'd really love to kind of frame that more and follow that up. So if people are interested in active bystander training, throw it to us in the questions, but I am aware I need to hand over to Kieran.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be speaking to you this morning or evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. For a number of years, I led the International Bar Association's work addressing bullying and sexual harassment within the legal profession. So my comments will be mainly addressed at workplace sexual harassment, although I appreciate that's tightly intersects with a much broader problem that we have in society. I always like to go back to history. When we were speaking before we started broadcasting, Jenna made the point that she's been covering these issues for decades, and things really, unfortunately, haven't changed. In workplace context, particularly in the legal profession, there has been empirical research that demonstrated that sexual harassment was widespread since really the early 80s in law, and in some other sectors even earlier. So we've known now for 40 years that these forms of conduct are occurring and are unacceptable. And yet here we are, 40, 50 years later. That said, notwithstanding that historical perspective, the Me Too movement, sparked by the New York Times and the New Yorker's reporting around the Harvey Weinstein incidents, brought incredible focus to these issues. In law, for a time, it felt like every week there was a new story in the newspapers all around the world about misdeeds, wrongdoing that was being called out and was leading to people being brought to account, leading to consequences. And so I think this autumn of discontent, as Dylan put it, in Australia and in the UK and elsewhere, 4 years on from the Me Too movement, can be looked at in one of two ways. It of course is a bad thing that incidents are still occurring and that people are still speaking up about not being heard when they tried to raise things internally, as the Brittany Higgins case demonstrated so powerfully and so scarringly in Australia. But I think it can also be looked at in a positive light, in that there is an enduring impact. The Me Too movement is continuing to lead to issues being brought to light and public momentum for change, underscoring that, which I think is certainly a positive because of that broader historical context that we've known for so long. And there have been flashes when we were doing work in the legal profession. If you look back, you saw every 5 or 10 years in different jurisdictions, there would be an incident, there would be outrage, there would be calls for people to do better, for systemic change, and then the momentum would dissipate. And so I think it's, in one respect, positive that the momentum, at least so far, has not dissipated. But I think what comes next is the million-dollar question. And we've seen some organisations, some professions, some institutions in Australia, in the UK and elsewhere respond really positively to having the spotlight shone on them and for things to lead to change. So we saw, for example, in Australia, our highest court, the High Court, it came out last year that a former justice of the High Court had have been found to have sexually harassed a number of his junior associates. The High Court apologised publicly, recognised the impact that it had on the targets of that conduct, had undertaken an independent investigation, and has since put in place a number of steps to ensure that conduct does not occur again in such an important institution in Australia. Contrast that to the way Australia's Parliament has dealt with recent incidents, and the Brittany Higgins one being the most high profile, but also others. Demonstrates that when these incidents come to the fore, some institutions and workplaces and professions have used them to give impetus to positive change, and some have flailed and not shown the commitment and the willingness to drive that change. But I do think whether it's the momentum is being put to use for good or being resisted, there is a risk that some of this is just busy work, is work for the sake of being seen to be acting on these things. And I think some of that will no doubt have a positive effect. Some of it won't have any effect. Some of it will have a negative effect. And the question is the momentum that stays behind that, and to the extent to which institutions use the momentum of the current moment to institutionalize change, to institutionalize things like flexible reporting models, workplace culture training, broader work on diversity and inclusion, on mental health, on alcohol, all various risk factors that point to these issues. As if we go back to that sweep of history, we have seen in some instances that lead to good, that scandal or outrage or incident-driven change can lead to good, but it can also lead to sort of short-term action that doesn't actually have enduring consequence. So I think that the challenge for all of us is ensuring that as we continue to maintain the momentum for positive change in our workplaces and in our society, in Australia, in England, all around the world, that change endures. There is no place for this conduct in our workplaces or anywhere else in our life. Sexual harassment is plainly wrong wherever it takes place, but yet we know that so many members of our society, and disproportionately female members of our society, experience it at work, at university, in public life. That's not okay. The Me Too movement and recent events in Australia and in the UK have given renewed momentum to efforts to eradicate this conduct from our lives. We all have a role to play in ensuring that momentum continues tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, in 2 years' time, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. Because otherwise, in 10 years' time, we'll be looking back at these moments, just as we can look back on other moments and see that change did not occur. There's no place for this, and we need that change now.
Thank you, Kieran. So I might invite all the panelists to turn on their webcams and I guess unmute themselves as we now go to the question and answer part of the forum. So I'd invite you, if you haven't already, to type some questions into the chat, in the Q&A chat there, and we'll work our way through them. But I might exercise my privilege, if I might, and as moderator. We shouldn't say that at a #MeToo forum, and ask this question of our panelists. So I work for a survivor. So I work for Professor Gemma Carey, who wrote this great book, No Matter Our Wreckage, which talks in detail about some fairly compelling stuff of being a survivor. And what we've seen, particularly in the autumn of discontent, is the people who've come out, so people we've known for a long time, and people that we know in many other contexts, have come out with stories that are incredibly compelling, horrifying, shocking. How do we, as people who are not survivors, provide support and work with and encouragement to people like that? I might ask Yasmin first and then let the rest of you weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, as someone that isn't a survivor myself, I can only speak, I guess, for more of an outsider's perspective. But I think it was really striking listening to Grace Tame during International Women's Day when she bravely shared her experience of ongoing sexual abuse. And from what I really gathered, and her real message is to just listen and understand without judgment. And I think we really saw what not to do actually when allegations against Christian Porter emerged, and we saw this whole thing about the rule of law, and it became just a really toxic conversation that really, I think, was really harmful to survivors who have so much stacked against them, especially including, as Jenna touched upon, the legal dimensions is just another added burden that survivors have to experience. So I think what was powerful about this movement is rallying together and showing that you are not alone. And I think in this experience, it can be so isolating, especially not only to experience that and be a survivor, but to experience the power dynamic at play that so often is involved in these incidents. And that could be, a minister, and that could be somebody's junior, and that could be, having to report to a boss, and all of these kind of other dimensions. It's a very difficult and isolating experience. So to provide support and even to provide a listening ear, I think is really important. And to not just, advise, but to actually hear and understand. So I think I have been really encouraged to see so many people do just that. And when I went to the March for Justice protests, looking at the diversity of the crowd was really powerful. And by that, yes, it was a particularly women-led movement, but diversity within that from all cultures, able, disabled, all LGBTQ, different cultures. There was just so many different types of people from all walks of life, but came together with the recognition that this is really important and this can't be swept under the rug. So I think it's just giving that platform and also listening carefully and with intent, I think is really important that we all need to do.
Thank you, Yasmin. Jenna Price, I might just direct a question to you. So there's a question in the chat, and it was, how do you see the current political inaction and a reinstatement of somebody like Barnaby Joyce, plus his inclusion on the Women's Task Force as being surmounted? Jenna, your thoughts?
My thoughts are complete horror. I do not know how that happened. I'm completely, and he's not the only problem on that Women's Safety Forum. There's a whole bunch of people who've never been involved in any of this stuff. There's hardly any representations from our First Nations communities. I think that unless this government changes, this will not improve for women and for men, or for men. And I don't say that ever imagining for 1 minute that the Labor Party is some magic pill where everything will be glorious. But I don't think this government is interested. We can see from Scott Morrison's responses to everything, but particularly around Brittany Higgins, particularly around Christian Porter, that this is not something he thinks happens to women he knows or women he cares about. And it was really a bit repellent when he said, Jen told me that I wouldn't want this to happen to my daughters, as if anyone who has any kind of compassion would need to know that sexual assault shouldn't happen to anybody, whether you're related to them or not. So I have no hope. I am the exact opposite of Yasmin. I'm sorry. Yasmin is a very hopeful person, but I'm filled with despair, and I'm not sure that, as I said to you all before we spoke, I've been covering this for 42 years. I'm not seeing any improvement, except that women are talking to each other. I love that. I think that's fantastic.
And just on that culture as well, if I could just jump in there, Dylan, I wanted to also add on that, I think, misunderstanding. Barnaby Joyce is one example, but even when Scott Morrison appointed more women into the cabinet, for example, an individual like Amanda Stoker, very conservative politician as the Assistant Minister for Women, somebody that's voted against a lot of women's issues, the gender pay gap, queer rights, all of these kind of stuff. So it isn't just also about, again, I think that reflects a lack of understanding about gender equality. It's having feminist thought and feminist analysis that's really essential here. And that's not a word, I think that's just used in Parliament in general, unfortunately, but I do think it shows again that lack of understanding about what women were calling for versus what was actually delivered, which just completely missed the mark, I think, of really representing and reflecting women's voices.
Sarah, I think you wanted to
add something. Yeah, I just add, like, I think the question that came before about what can we do about this, your responses have been really high level, which I think is really important because we need that political impetus, the professional impetus, etc. But there's a pretty simple thing you can do when somebody tells you they're the survivor of sexual assault, harassment, rape. You can say, I believe you. What do you want or need from me? Like, 11 words. It's pretty easy to say. And I think that's something that certainly with this huge online movement and with all of the backlash to like hirings and firings and appointments and things like that, we forget that this everyday lived experience for so many people. I mean, Dylan, you've referred to your boss being somebody who's a survivor. Yasmin, you said you're not a survivor of sexual assault, but you probably have been of harassment. I don't think you can go through an Australian school system without being harassed. Like, frankly, as a former Aussie schoolgirl, the uniform, walking down the street, I used to get, like, I was 12 when men used to holler things at me that are totally inappropriate. And if your skirt was too short, you were slut shamed. If your skirt was too long, you were frigid. Like, it was damned whatever I did, I felt when I was a teenage girl. I was too fat to be attractive, then I was too curvy and I was putting it out there. I moved to the UK and I thought that that would change, and it wasn't any better here. It was sexual assaults and violence here. Kieran, I've had a very senior member of the bar in this country put his hand on my bottom in front of all my students to guide me to a dinner table. These sorts of things happen in their way all the time. And in the legal profession, I've seen it particularly. So I was really pleased to see your report. But I think the everyday action that we can take is to say, I believe you. It's such a simple and empowering thing. And to follow it up with an empowering opportunity to ask that person what they want. Some people will want to go to court. Some people will want to go to journalists. Some people will want their story publicly told to achieve things. Other people will just want acknowledgement that that's what happened to them and the offer of help as and when they want it, if they ever do. And I think that empowerment message needs to come across, and we need to equip people to deal with these disclosures. It's really hard when you're standing in front of somebody you've known for decades, who you put up on a pedestal, and they tell you they were sexually assaulted. You respect them, you want all these things, but what do you actually say that's not condescending, that's not disempowering? We need to actually start to incorporate training, not just to say to the actual perpetrator, that's bad, but we need to incorporate the ability to say to survivors, I believe you. What do you want now? Thank you for being so brave. Thank you for saying that. Thank you for telling us these things that help us understand your experience and the experience of millions of people worldwide, billions of people worldwide, in fact. Now, what do we do? What do you want? I'm here to empower you, to include you. And I think that's one thing that's been missing, I think, a lot on social media for me.
And I just wanted to, echo those amazing remarks by Sarah and everyone else, and say, I guess at an institutional level, I think what that looks like is empowering people to speak up in whatever way they feel comfortable. I think too often institutions and workplaces try and funnel people through an avenue for reporting that suits the workplace or the institution or the law enforcement agency, etc. But what we need to do is empower people to speak up to whatever extent and in whatever way they feel comfortable. When we did the survey at the IBA that prompted our work in this area, we heard thousands of stories all told to us anonymously. And so many people said to us, this is the first time that I've ever told anyone. And they were telling it to this survey we ran. If that was all they did, and if that helped them in some way, and certainly helped us in terms of our research and then driving change, that's fantastic. That's all that's needed, even if that's only anonymous. If then they feel comfortable speaking up, making a formal complaint, through whatever mechanism, that's great. But I think we have to give people as many options as possible so that when they're in this moment, when they've experienced this either historically or contemporaneously, they feel empowered to speak up.
So we've got a question in the chat, which I think is quite an interesting one, because one of the issues that really got me interested in many issues got me interested in #MeToo was the crossovers with racism and the synergy in terms of the experience of what that was like to experience racism and for many women, I think, to experience racism and sexual harassment. So we've got a question about, do we believe that the hashtag #MeToo movement in Australia is truly intersectional? Can I hand that over to the panel? Sarah, do you want to have a best go at that?
So I think it's a really interesting thing. I can speak to the fact that not just in Australia, but in the UK, I think there's an increasing overlap, that there is a recognition that Indigenous women, here in the UK, minority ethnic women, including Black women, are disproportionately affected and experience sexual harassment in a way that overlaps with racism, in a way where they're hypersexualized because of their race or ethnicity. Those things are becoming increasingly recognized, certainly in a number of professional reports here that is being acknowledged. So you're obviously seeing me work in a space where we're trying to do the doing bit, the next part of this, of moving that forward. I'm not seeing the high level political action that brings these issues together. I'm seeing higher level association. So one thing I was really pleased to see was the reports on racism here in the UK in the medical professions, asking people to do this kind of active bystander training to see and act. But the thing that distressed me is that wasn't coupled with sexual harassment, and it wasn't acknowledged that those two issues dovetail in that same report. So I'm seeing lots of reports come out that put these separately and don't see these as actual intersectional issues when we come to the doing bit. How do we actually address this? That said, one thing I've been seriously pleased to see in all of the interventions I have been involved in Australia at ANU, here at the University of Cambridge, when it comes to breaking the silence into active action, a lot of the training does acknowledge microaggressions, does acknowledge harassment, does acknowledge the intersectional nature of this, increasingly becoming queer sensitive, and looking at LGBTQ+ issues. I noted there was a question for me in the question box, which I can just shoot out the answer to straight off the bat, which is, it's a diverse set of people that target LGBTQ+ individuals and trans individuals when they're sexually assaulted. Somebody asked, who are the perpetrators of this violence against those particular groups? And the answer is, diverse as they are against women. But troublingly for me, the data that we've collected, that I've worked with in a public health setting, show that many trans individuals, which is a data set I've been working with, experience violence at the hands of the authorities themselves. They experience sexual assault in prisons, in police stations, in healthcare settings at a disproportionately high rate. And why I say that is that absolutely women have experienced sexual assault, violence, etc. in public and private settings. They're likely to be targeted by domestic partners and other people, which we've done a lot of work to dispel the stranger danger myth over the last 20 years, from when I was a kid and got the like, everybody is lurking in the trees kind of message. But what I think is really important to emphasize around trans and queer individuals is that it's when they seek help that they get targeted. And that distressed me no end, seeing those data points. And I would love to see more advocates from the community speaking. I don't want to speak for people, but I certainly have found, as somebody who works with that public health content, it deeply distressing that that's the fact. And so that's kind of where I would come from in saying, I think we have a lot of work left to do.
I also wanted to add to that I think this is a conversation fundamentally about power. It is power, and power does create intersectional effects, because it's how is power distributed, where do resources go, whose voices are naturally privileged and amplified in political debate, who gets to these decision-making spaces. So that is where it all kind of combines and aligns. So there's one aspect of Me Too and asking if it's intersectional, which is talking about representation. So who is at the forefront, whose voices are being privileged, whose voices are not being heard in that conversation. And I think in the recent movement in Australia, there was a level of intersectional dialogue. So there was conversations around Indigenous women. I heard a really powerful statement that since the beginning of colonisation here in Australia, it was sexual violence against Indigenous women. This is not a recent or new phenomenon. This is traces back historically. That was an important point, but I don't know that it really has become the forefront and leading moment of conversation, not to mention the fact that minorities experience disproportionate rates of sexual violence. We're protests on behalf of them, whereas the community anger. So there is definitely that aspect in terms of representation, but that second part about power is thinking about resources. So we know that people who, again, those that disproportionately experience domestic violence are usually have, less access to financial independence, maybe under more state surveillance, welfare and all that kind of stuff. So these are other factors that increase rates. So for example, YWCA Australia provides domestic violence housing support to often women that have to flee from their homes. So it's a question about resources then as well. So where is the government putting resources? And we know that there's still a complete lack of funding towards domestic violence services as well, which again overlaps with race, class, and other factors like that. So I think it's that representation piece, and then also maybe the state and resources conversation to be had. So in terms of whether it's intersectional, I don't think it's there yet. It's hard to kind of quantitatively measure that. Conversations have started, but there's still so much room for overlap.
And I guess the thing that's important for us to know is that the federal government has removed funding from the peak First Nations family violence group, peak body. So that means that there's no kind of overarching body that can represent their needs. It's a kind of tactic they've used again against community legal centres as well. So they really try and cut funding to any of these groups that advocate for First Nations women or advocate for vulnerable and marginalised groups. I mean, the funding is key to everything, really. You can do a lot if you've got the money, and you can't do anything. And they're just trying to starve them out of existence, but worse, they're trying to silence them by defunding them.
So Jenna, I've just got a question for you. And so we had two very high profile criminal cases against rugby league players for sexual assault. And one of the things I know as a person who follows the code was, as soon as those cases were concluded, all the noise died down. There was no action or language in that context about how we need to do better as a community, as a code or anything like that. Can men change? How should other men respond? Is improvement possible here?
So as soon as Peter V'landys took over the NRL, I knew we were not going to be having any input from someone like Kathy Lumby, who was a kind of consultant to the NRL for a long time over trying to change behaviour, change culture. Can men change? I can't tell you because I'm not a man, but I'm not seeing any change. And I've been writing about the problems with the patriarchy for a very long time, and I'm not seeing much of a shift. I mean, you do see some improvements at what I would call a micro level. So more men are taking parental leave, and more men are doing a little bit more housework, but these things are minuscule. And the big problems, which are violence against women, both physical, emotional, spiritual, financial, they continue. And I personally think that our current aim, which is about fiddling with domestic violence laws, introducing coercive control legislation, I think we need to do a whole rethink and say to ourselves, we are going to start teaching fantastic, respectful relationships before they're toddlers. And I think the change will be. There has been some really promising work around respectful relations and respectful relationships training in primary schools and preschools, but it's not funded to any extent. But I don't think we can change men by legislating against them. I think we have to change the culture, and that's got to start at the beginning. And I personally don't think the government's very interested in that. I don't think it's so hard. It's hard for people to say, we are going to toss out everything we've ever taught about PE, PD, physical development, consent training, and start at a very primal start. I just don't think anyone's interested in doing that, but I think that's what needs to happen. I think that's the only thing that will make men change. Men are not innately bad, but they've been told they can run the joint, and they do, and they do it. I mean, not just in rugby league. Also, I'm a Bunnies supporter, so I feel your pain about how men behave in the game. But I think it's a very big project and we kind of fiddle around the edges.
And I think Jenna's point is sadly borne out by what we know about sexual harassment on university campuses during undergraduate education, and then what we know about it in the workplace. I mean, the data in both of those contexts is extensive, empirical. We know sexual harassment is rife at university and then in the workplace, and people don't sort of go through, and young boys and men go through, and then they don't get to, you know, first year of university and suddenly become a rapist or a sexual harasser. They don't go through university and then get to the workplace if they go through university to get their education and then suddenly become a sexual harasser. You know, that, as Jenna says, that at the moment is the paradigm we're working with, and we're trying to fiddle here and there, but it fundamentally misunderstands that all of this begins when people are 5.
And I would just go further to say as well, one thing that I would just add is that it's also not just unique to men. One thing I've experienced a lot of in teaching this content and working on this content is that women can be just as bad as embodying some of these things. Like the number of times I hear kind of languages of slut shaming. When I hear girls be like, well, she was doing this and she was doing that, and it embodies a lot of that code. And I particularly see a lot of it online amongst young women, which really concerns me, where somebody's been brave enough to talk about their experiences, and you look through the comments and it's not just your incel kind of comments from dudes with precarious masculinity, but there's a lot of women jumping on board there. There's an inability, of course, to determine whether some of those things are actually fake accounts. Like, I'm well aware that it's difficult to discern sometimes, but it really does trouble me. And one of the things that I've always found really hard in teaching active bystander training is I can give people languages to respond when they see poor behavior, to intervene and say, that's unacceptable, don't say that. And I see comments come back unmeaningly in those sessions that are like, yeah, but I'll sound a bit gay. And there's so many reasons why the homophobia that's wrapped up in that, the patriarchal comments that are wrapped up in that, what we call oftentimes here in the UK lad culture, which is I think what we see play out in that rugby setting and things like that. And when I hear this from even women, I worry that this pervasive culture that we're trying to change, that Jenna, you're saying has just been decades and decades and decades of it, is also now playing out online, where there's even a different dynamic going on.
And I think when it's sorry, Dylan. Yeah,
no,
I can just add
the last word, Yasmin, please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, there's so much to just. I just want to like talk about everything and just talk about it for ages. But again, I think that comes down to power. So who's controlling this narrative? Why is it that even women are using this kind of narrative to disempower themselves? And again, I think this is because women are not have not been given the platform and space to really, have this conversation and really be heard. And I think about, I came across a video on YouTube the other day of men talking about Me Too, sitting in a circle and talking about Me Too. And it actually felt quite emotional because it was actually the first time I'd ever seen men as a group talking about this one-on-one and saying, I've been a bystander, or I've said this, I've done that. Now I look back and realize it was wrong. And I think throughout this movement, there's an interesting space about, well, where do men fit in? And I'm not a man, so I don't think I can authoritatively speak to that, because I also think that's a conversation men need to be actively having within, male circles and male communities. And how are you standing for ending up and speaking out? And how are you using this position of privilege in order to, I guess, how are you recognizing this position of privilege in order to amplify others? And it was quite disheartening to even see the reaction of young men during that petition for more consent education. A lot of anger and a lot of hostility, but you have to think, have their parents sat down and had a conversation about how to navigate through this and how to work through this discomfort or anger or frustration, and how to work through these feelings and kind of come out on the other end? Because to me, when I see young men react in this way, it's a failure for parents and communities to be actively having these conversations. So for me, it starts with giving young women the space to have this platform, having young women as champions of this, so other young women can see that and think, I don't have to, be ashamed, and I don't have to sit back and be quiet. So I think that space for men is one that men need to create. But I think, as this recent movement has shown, it's absolutely essential, and it just can't be sidelined or ignored.
Thank you, Yasmin. This has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you to all our panelists. I might just call upon Julian Huppert to say a few words in closing. Julian.
Well, thank you very much to everybody who's been here. It's been absolutely fascinating, absolutely terrifying in many ways. I've learned so much, not so much about the UK situation, but about just how awful many things seem in Australia, which has been really bad. But thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you to everybody who has listened in and has put in such wonderful questions. I'd just like to pick up one comment that came in from Angelica. Not a question, but thank you to facilitators and all presenters for this amazing discussion. More, please. And I think that last piece is really important, because there is a lot more to do about this. We have to tackle this in schools, we have to tackle this in the legal system, we have to tackle this at every level. As I said at the beginning, in a few months' time, we at Jesus College will be launching a programme on edX that will look at this in much more detail. So it will be a course which you can take online. You can get a certificate for it if you'd like to. You can encourage your university or institution, whatever it may be, to get people to do that course, which will not only look at what has happened, but perhaps even more importantly, what we can do about it in the future, what you can do about it in the future. Whatever gender, whatever ethnicity, we all have a part to play. So thank you very much for being with us. I hope to see you sign up for that course, but also to come to any of the other events that we run at the Jesus College Intellectual Forum. If this was your first one, I hope to see you back for many others. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your days, however long they may be.